Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started tonight. Everybody will take a seat. We'll go ahead and get started. I'll allow the jokes get worse as we go on. Okay, we're going to thank you for joining tonight's Bible study. Tonight we're studying through the Bible, trying to get through it in 1 year, 1 week at a time, about 2 hours per week, which means we spend about we go through about 21, 22 chapters per week. Tonight we'll be going through 2 Samuel chapter 19 through 1 Kings chapter 11. So if you will, go ahead and turn to 2 Samuel. I think we're actually going to start around chapter 15, just do a little brief review so we can get the context of where we left off from last time. I think chapter 15 should cover it. So 2 Samuel chapter 15. In 2 Samuel you have David as king. Remember, Saul was the first king of Israel, at least in man. God, of course, was the first king. And then since Israel rejected God as their king, they elected Saul, chose Saul. He disobeyed God, and so God removed him as king and chose a man after God's own heart, David. Man after God's own heart, meaning he is a man of war, just like the Lord said he is in Exodus chapter 15 verse 3, as far as executing the judgment of God that God had declared Israel should do, utterly destroying those nations that are in the promised land because God has already judged them. So David was doing this. And now when we get to chapter 15, actually in chapter 2 Samuel chapter 12, I don't mean to keep going back farther, but 2 Samuel chapter 11, you have David's great sin against by committing adultery with Bathsheba and then having Uriah and other men of the old. But God punishes him by saying there's going to be the sword won't depart from your household, so there'll be some death in your household, and that you see some rebellion. That's what we have in chapter 15, where Absalom, David's son, had revolted against David in chapter 15 of 2 Samuel, took the throne for himself, and David fled from him. And then basically you have some stories about how Absalom there being in the king's house in Jerusalem, and advice is given to him. Finally in chapter 18, where we left off the last chapter we covered last time, Absalom was killed by Joab. David had said, go after the army. Joab was David's commander-in-chief basically in the army. And David said, go ahead and go after Absalom and his men, but do not kill Absalom. It's David's son. Joab disobeys David's order, and at the very end of chapter 18, with Absalom has died, as far as David finds out that his son Absalom is dead. There, the last verse in chapter 18 of 2 Samuel, verse 33, says, the king was much moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went thus, he said, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son. And then when we start in chapter 19, that's where we start, because down in verse 4, chapter 19, you see him mourning again. It says, but the king covered his face, and the king cried with a loud voice, O my son Absalom, O Absalom, my son, my son. So that's where we start tonight. Chapter 19 of 2 Samuel, the main theme of this chapter is David's return to Israel. With Absalom, his son, being dead, you have there in the household. Basically, David doesn't come back right away. He's still mourning the death of Absalom, and Joab comes to him in verse 5. We'll pick up there, chapter 19, verse 5. Joab came into the house to the king and said, Thou hast the faces of all thy servants, which this day have saved thy life, and the lives of thy sons and of thy daughters, and the lives of thy wives, and the lives of thy concubines. And that thou lovest thine enemies, and hatest thy friends. For thou hast declared this day that thou regardest neither princes nor servants. For this day I perceive that if Absalom had lived, and all we had died this day, then it had pleased thee well. Now therefore arise, go forth, and speak comfortably unto thy servants. For I swear by the Lord, if thou go not forth, there will not tarry one with thee this night, and that will be worse unto thee than all the evil that befell thee from thy youth until now. So what you have happening here is that with Absalom being dead, he was the king temporarily in Jerusalem while David had fled. And so now with Absalom being dead, Israel is sort of in a disarray here. They don't have somebody who's king. David had fled from Absalom. Remember, he fled to the other side of Jordan, so he's not even in Jerusalem. And the people of Israel, they're saying, what are we going to do? Seems like David has a band. He's not coming back. He was our king, and we don't have Absalom. So Joab's concern is, hey, David, if you don't come back, Israel, they're just going to appoint somebody else as king, so you need to come back. And so that's what he does. He returns with the support of all Israel. Go down to verse 14. You see there that he bowed the heart of all the men of Judah, even as the heart of one man, so that they sent this word unto the king, unto David, said, Return thou and all thy servants. So the king returned and came to Jordan, and Judah came to Gilgal to go to meet the king to conduct the king of Jordan. Verse 18, you have him coming back, says, there went over a ferry boat to carry over the king's household, and to do what he thought good. And Shimei the son of Gera fell down before the king as he was come over Jordan. Shimei, he had, just before David left, he went and he figured, he's safe from David. David's fleeing, Absalom's in control, so Shimei is saying, well, now, David, I'm really going to tell you what I think of you. And Shimei curses David. So now that David's coming back, he's sort of eating crow here, and he's fallen down before David and begging for his life, basically. So you can read that on your own. But the point here, chapter 19, is that David comes back to Israel with the support of Israel. But Israel is known for being wishy-washy. They can, like they said back at Exodus chapter 19, they said, when God had spoke through Moses, it gave him the law, and he says, Israel says, all one accord, they said, we will do this. We promise to keep the law. And then you find before Moses even gets off the Mount Sinai, before he even receives all the law and comes down, they already built a golden calf, and they're bowing down to the golden calf, and they're having this party. So Israel is known from going from one extreme to the other, and that's what happens down in, if you look at verse 41, the end of the chapter there, chapter 19 of 2 Samuel, verse 41, it says, And behold, all the men of Israel came to the king, and said unto the king, Why have our men of Judah stolen thee away, and have brought the king and his household, and all David's men with him over Jordan? So it was Judah that brought David over Jordan, and the other 10 tribes, the Israeli tribes, they're saying, hey, you're our king too. Why couldn't we bring you over? Verse 42, And all the men of Judah answered the men of Israel, Because the king is near of kin to us. Wherefore then be ye angry for this matter? Have we eaten at all of the king's cost, or hath he given us any gift? The men of Israel answered the men of Judah and said, We have 10 parts in the king, and we have also more right in David than ye. Why then did ye despise us, that our advice shall not be first head, and bring him back our king? And so basically you have Israel and Judah fighting over who gets to bring David over into Jerusalem, back to the land of Israel over Jordan. But then right away, chapter 20, verse 1, you have, And there happened to be there a man of Belial, whose name was Sheba, the son of Bichri, a Benjamite. And he blew a trumpet and said, We have no part in David, neither have we inheritance in the son of Jesse. As 10, O Israel. So every man of Israel went up from after David, and followed Sheba, the son of Bichri. But the men of Judah clave unto their king from Jordan even to Jerusalem. So you see how Israel just goes from one extreme to the other. At first they're fighting and saying, hey, he's our king, why don't we get the chance to bring him in? And then next thing they're saying, oh, we have no king, let's return to our own tents. And so even though David returns to Israel, you have those 10 tribes there in Israel who are revolting, basically. So you have Sheba getting Israel to abandon David there in the first 2 verses of chapter 20. And then the next main point there in chapter 20 is David has Sheba killed. Basically, he's back as king, and he doesn't want the kingdom to be divided here, and have the 10 tribes of Israel going against him, and causing a revolt, or Sheba forming a coup and trying to take over as king. And so he has Sheba killed. You look down in verse 6, it says, And David said to Abishai, Now shall Sheba the son of Bichri do us more than Absalom. Take thou thy Lord's servants and pursue after him, lest he get him fenced cities and escape us. And so that's what they do. And then if you jump down to verse 21, you see, the matter is not so, but a man of Mount Ephraim, Sheba the son of Bichri by name, hath lifted up his hand against the king, even against David. Deliver him only, will depart from the city. And the woman said unto Joab, Behold, his head shall be thrown to thee over the wall. Then the woman went unto all the people in her wisdom, and they cut off the head of Sheba the son of Bichri, and cast it out to Joab. And he blew a trumpet, and they retired from the city, every man to his tent. And Joab returned to Jerusalem unto the king. So what had happened here is that Sheba had fled to a fenced city. He was in there, and they were sort of protecting him. And there was a wise woman there who realized, hey, if we don't give Joab and the men of David, David's army, what they want, they're going to destroy the whole city. And so she promises here, don't worry, we'll kill Sheba for you, but protect us. And so that's what happens. Sheba dies, and so the revolt is over there. David is established as king over Israel and Judah. So then when we get to chapter 21, the two main points of chapter 21, you have David's proper response to famine. That's in the first 6 verses of chapter 21. And then the last part of chapter 21, verses 18 through 22, Israel kills 4 Philistine giants. So when we start at chapter 21, verse 1, you see it says, Then there was a famine in the days of David 3 years, year after year. And David inquired of the Lord. And the Lord answered, It is for Saul and for his bloody house, because he slew the Gibeonites. So you're thinking, well, what's going on here? Why is God punishing Israel because they slew the Gibeonites? Weren't they supposed to utterly destroy those nations around them? And the answer is they were supposed to, but what had happened, if you remember, you hold your place there, go back to Joshua chapter 9. In Joshua, when Israel had first entered the promised land, they took over Jericho, the Gibeonites, they tricked Israel into thinking that they were part of, they were far away. They weren't in that promised land, but they were far away. They make a covenant with Israel. So back in Joshua chapter 9, Joshua chapter 9, look at verse 3. Joshua chapter 9, verse 3. And when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done unto Jericho and to Ai, they did work wily, and went and made as if they had been ambassadors. And so then you find out this, so they pretend like they're coming from a far country, and the result, verse 15, And Joshua made peace with them, and made a league with them, to let them live. And the princes of the congregation swear unto them. So God doesn't like this. They weren't supposed to make a league with Gibeon. Joshua and his men should have consulted with God to see what God would have had them to do. Instead, without going by God's guidance, they go ahead and make a covenant with Gibeon. And so when you get to Saul, you never see it recorded in Saul's days. But here, finally, in 2 Samuel chapter 21, you can go back there and let go of Joshua. 2 Samuel 21, you're told that Saul did kill the Gibeonites, and that was breaking the covenant that Israel had made with them. And because of that, then God punishes them by having a famine in the days of David 3 years. And I mentioned that this is David's proper response to famine because he sees there's a famine, so he says, okay, God is chastising us. And so then he goes to God and says, what's going on here? And so he finds out from God that it's because Saul slew the Gibeonites. And so verses 2 through 6 here, you have verse 2, the king called the Gibeonites and said unto them, you go down to verse 3 there, it says, Wherefore David said unto the Gibeonites, What shall I do for you? And wherewith shall I make the atonement, that ye may bless the inheritance of the Lord? And the Gibeonites said unto him, We silver nor gold of Saul, nor of his house, neither for us shalt thou kill any man in Israel. And he said, Well, what you shall say that will I do for you. And they answered the king, The man that consumed us and that devised against us, that would be Saul, that we should be destroyed from remaining in any of the coast of Israel, let 7 men of his sons be delivered unto us, and we will hang them up unto the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, whom the Lord did choose. And the king said, I will give them. Verse 8, it says, But the king took the 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Ai, whom she bare unto Saul, Armoni and Mephibosheth, and the 5 sons of Michal, the daughter of Saul, whom she brought up for Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Mehalothite. So David, the Gibeonite, says, basically you can make atonement for your sin of breaking this covenant by bringing 7 sons of Saul. We'll kill them and hang them up. And so that's what they do here. And so then the famine is stayed. Verse 14 tells us, Saul and Jonathan his son buried they in the country of Benjamin and Zelah, and the sepulchre of Kish his father, and they performed all that the king commanded, and after that God was entreated for the land. So you see David's smart move in realizing, this famine of 3 years is a punishment by God, and so let's make it right. Let's make atonement so we can get relieved of this punishment. And so by doing that, the famine, God is entreated for the land, meaning the famine is lifted. But notice there we mentioned there in verse 8 where Michal, 5 sons of Michal, the daughter of Saul, were taken and killed. Michal's really had a tough life here. If you remember, she was first introduced when David had killed. Saul said, I will give my daughter to be the wife of whoever will kill 100 Philistines. And David goes one step further. He kills 200 Philistines. And so that he promises Michal to David to be his wife. But then Saul gets hatred in his heart for David. So Michal goes to another one. Saul gives her over to another man to be his wife. So, Michal really doesn't have control over what happens. What ends up happening, she's betrothed to David, and she's given over to some other man. Finally, she goes back to David as his wife. Then she goes over to another man. Saul takes her away from David, goes over as a wife of another man. And then David, when he becomes king, he wants Michal back. The Michal's husband is going crying after him. David already has 6 wives, as we saw last week, but he wants Michal, so he gets the 7th wife. So now Michal goes from the first husband to David to the 3rd husband, then back to David. Then David gets mad at her for being jealous and won't have anything to do with her. And now you think, now her troubles are over, but now her 5 sons are killed. So Michal really had it tough here, and there's really nothing she could do about it, hardly. It was just the condition the way it was, where women were property of either their father or of their husband, and she just had to go along with it. Down there in verse, so anyway, the point of chapter 21 there, the famine being stayed. And then in verse 8, you have David and his army starts fighting the Philistines. Moreover, there, 2 Samuel chapter 21, verse 15 says, Moreover, the Philistines had yet war again with Israel, and David went down and his servants with him, and fought against the Philistines, and David waxed faint. So you have here David, he's getting on in life. This is probably the last battle that he fights, and he's not able to defeat the giant because he is older, but someone steps in and defeats him for him. But a good point of this is we had mentioned before how things were happening where David wouldn't take revenge on. He was a man of war in terms of willing to fight for the Lord at what God had commanded. But when someone wronged David, he let the Lord take vengeance. God says, "I will repay." David relied upon the Lord to do that and not doing it himself. And so people get the idea that David was weak. Toward the end of his life, at first he was this man of war and he fought all these people. At the end of life, he got soft. But that's not the case at all, because here he is at the end of his life, and he's willing to go out and do what God had wanted him to do. Fight, utterly destroy the Philistines. So he's out there fighting against a giant. But then he just ends up not able to defeat him just because of his age there. And as you go down there in the passage there, we'll just read verse 16 there. It says, And Ichbi-Benob, which was of the sons of the giant, the weight of whose spear weighed 300 shekels of brass in weight, he being girded with a new sword, thought to have slain David. But Abishai the son of Zeruiah secured him, and smote the Philistines, and killed him. Then the men of David sware unto him, saying, Thou shalt go no more out with us to battle, that thou quench not the light of Israel. And it came to pass after this battle with the Philistines at Gob, then Sibishai the Hushahite slew, which was of the sons of the giant. So there's a second giant being slain. Verse 19, There was again a battle in Gob with the Philistines, where Elihanan, the son of Jerah-Oregim, a Bethlehemite, slew the brother of Goliath the Gittite, the staff of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. So there's a third giant slain. Verse 20, And there was yet a battle in Gath, where was a man of great stature, that had on every hand 6 fingers, and on every foot 6 toes, 24 in number, and he also was born to the giant. And when he defied Israel, Jonathan the son of Shimei, the brother of David, slew them. These 4 were born to the giant in Gath, and fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. So the point here is that, remember the way these giants came about, back in Genesis chapter 6, we won't go over that, but with Noah and the flood, the reason that Noah and the flood came about was because there were these giants where these devils were having sex with women, human women, and you had some spiritual mixing with human blood, and as a result you had sort of superhuman giants that were born, tall men. In this case, you had one guy who had 6 fingers on every hand and 6 toes on every foot, and so you had these people. And in fact, we could go down to if you go over to chapter 23, we'll look at another one, chapter 23, verse 20. 2 Samuel chapter 23, verse 20, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, the son of a valiant man of Kabzeel, who had done many acts, he slew 2 lion-like men of Moab. He went down also and slew a lion in the midst of a pit in time of snow. So you have there a lion-like men. So these giants they're superhuman. These 2 look like lions, lion-like men. And then back in chapter 21, you have this man with the extra fingers and toes. And it shows that these aren't regular people, and that back in Genesis chapter 6, it tells you that there was these giants in the land, and the flood destroyed them. But then it also says that there was another batch of giants that came about later, and that's why God has pronounced judgment upon those, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, etc., in the Promised Land, because they are of that mixed blood, devil and human blood, to create these giants. And so the point is that there's still some of these around, and since Israel was called to utterly destroy them, you have David and his men destroying these giants. So that's the end of chapter 21. Another point I wanted to make here, in verse 19, we read about how it said that Elhanan, the son of Jair-Oregim, a Bethlehemite, slew the brother of Goliath the Gittite. For those who know that we use the King James Version of the Bible because it is the inspired, preserved Word of God without error, and that other versions have errors. If you've ever studied the different versions to see where the errors are, sometimes this verse is brought up because the older versions, the NASB and the NIV, both those 2 versions, say that he slew Goliath. They leave the brother of out of, which would make the word of God a lie, because it says Elhanan slew Goliath, whereas in 1 Samuel chapter 17 you had David slaying Goliath. So both can't be right, and so that verse sometimes is brought up to show that the other translations, that of course there are hundreds and hundreds of differences, errors in these other. Well, not errors, they're purposely done. This isn't a study in the version, so we won't get into that. But there are differences in these other versions from the King James, differences from the pure Word of God. And this verse is brought up a lot of times. I wanted to make mention that it's only in those 2 versions, NIV and NASB. NIV, since 2011 is the 400th anniversary of the King James Version of the Bible, the NIV, trying to steal some of the glory from the real Bible, they came out with their own updated version in 2011, and I checked that one. In the NIV of 2011, they've actually added their brother of back into this verse. So currently the NASB is the only one that says that he slew Goliath here in 2 Samuel 21:19. Of course, there are still hundreds of other errors in the NIV, even in the 2011 version, but I did want to point that out for those who look at those things